All right, chapter 2, we are going to go over decimals. I know this is something you have seen in any math class you've taken. Two rules you definitely need to be aware about. You always need to place a 0 in front of a decimal point, okay? It can be, if you write a decimal without a 0, somebody might miss that little tiny decimal in the medical field, and instead of 0.6 milligrams, if you write 0.6, they might take that as a 6 and make a medical error. So always remember, for testing purposes, you have to write a 0 before a decimal point. Another rule of thumb, you should never do a trailing 0. You should never have 0.60 milligrams, because in the medical field, for instance, again, if you're giving 0.6 milligrams, somebody might take that as 60 milligrams. So we do not like trailing zeros, okay? For testing purposes, you will always leave off a trailing 0. 0.6 is the appropriate way to write it, not 0.60. We will always remember, we will never write 0.6. We will always put a 0 in front of a decimal point, so 0.6. Those are just general rules of decimal points, okay? So let's get started with the lecture. All right. When you open up your books to chapter 2, you need to pay attention to page 34, the top, that chart. You need to understand that there's a big difference of how things, the terminology after your decimal point. So say your decimal point's right there. If you have a spot, the first spot to the right of the decimal point, it is known as tenths, okay? This spot to the left of the decimal point, the first spot, is ones. And the second spot is tens, okay? There's a very big difference between tens and tenths. So make sure you know and understand that chart. Another thing you need to be able to do is you need to be able to write out the words of a decimal point. So if I give you the decimal 0.4, how are you going to write that into words? We do not say 0.4. We would say this is 4 tenths. Okay? If you have 0.6, how you write that into words is 6 tenths. And again, this should absolutely be a review from previous math classes. So make sure you also understand how to write decimals out into words, okay? Any numbers with decimals, for instance, 10.2, to write it out in words, it would be 10 and 2 tenths. So again, for testing purposes, you need to understand how to write decimals, or numbers, not just decimal point, numbers with decimals into words. I am going to let you know, the chapter goes very in-depth about how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide decimals. You will have a calculator available every test in the nursing program, and you will have a calculator available for the NCLEX. If it asks you to add multiple decimals, this class is not to reteach you basic math. I highly recommend you take your calculator out and add all those decimals together. If it asks you to subtract multiple decimals, I highly suggest you take your calculator out and subtract the numbers with decimals together. You can easily, your calculator has the capability of adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing decimals. There should not be an issue with that. If you want to do it longhand, by all means, that is your choice. I am not going to show you that because this is not a basic math class. There is something that the book talks about in terms of multiplying by the power of 10. This is the top of page 36, okay? Multiplying by power of 10. When it means multiplying by power of 10, think about your multiples of 10. You can have 10, 100, 1,000. That is multiplying by the power of 10. Of course, you again could easily take your calculator out. For instance, if it gives you the example, 10.256, and it wants you to multiply by the power of 10, multiply by 10, you could easily take your calculator out and multiply by 10. There is a little trick when you're multiplying by the power of 10. Instead of having to use it with your calculator, all you need to do is move the decimal point to the right, the number of zeros in the power of 10. As you can see, when we're multiplying by 10, the power of 10, we have 1 0 in the number 10. Literally, you could take this decimal point right here and move it to the right one spot, and instead of using your calculator, 10.256 multiplied by the power of 10 is 102.56. You can easily move your decimal point over one spot to the right, the number of zeros. If I tell you to multiply 10.256 to the power of 100, well, now we're counting, we have 2 zeros in 100. So you're going to take your decimal point and move it to the right 2 zeros. So 10.256 multiplied by the power of 100, or times 100, you move your decimal point over 2 spots to the right, gives you 1,025.6. So instead of taking your calculator out, your book shows you how to multiply by the power of 10 by moving your decimal point to the right. And again, when you're multiplying by the power of 10, you move your decimal point to the right, the number of zeros. So if you're multiplying by 10, you move your decimal point to the right one time. If you're multiplying by 100, you move your decimal point to the right 2 times. If you multiply by 1,000, you move your decimal point to the right 3 times. Again, you move your decimal point to the right, the number of zeros that you have in your 10, in your power of 10, shall you say. Again, like I said, could you easily take your calculator out and just multiply that number by 10, 100, 1,000, whatever power of 10 they give you? Yes. But the book shows you how to do it by moving your decimal point. The other thing the book shows you is when you are multiplying by the power of the 10th, okay, or 1/10. There's a big difference between power of 10 versus power of 1/10. So this is when you are multiplying by, now we are talking about the power of 1/10. There's a very big difference between 10 and 10th. Make sure you understand this, okay? So the book shows you, again, when we multiply by power of 10, we're moving our decimal point to the right, the number of zeros in the number. Well, when we're multiplying by the power of 10th, you move your decimal point to the left, the number of all the numbers after the decimal point, okay, or after 0. So when we multiply by 10th, let's do that same number, 10.256. The rule is move your decimal point to the left, the number of all numbers after the decimal point. Well, we have one number after the decimal point. So we will move our decimal point 1 point to the left. So 10.256 multiplied by the power of 1/10 is 1.0256. Okay? Now let's talk about multiplying by the power of 100th. Okay? 100th is very different from 100. So your power of 1/10 can be 1/10. It can be 100th. It can be 1,000th. But you will always think your rule is to move the decimal point left to the left, all the numbers after the decimal point. So with 1/10, we have one number. With 100th, we have two numbers. And 1,000th, we have three numbers. So that's how we would move our decimal point. Again, can you easily pull out your calculator and just multiply the number by the number we give you? Absolutely. But this is just a quick method to do it. So let's do our 10.256 times, let's do 1,000th. Okay, if we want to do the rule of moving our decimal point to the left, remember we move it to the left, all the numbers past the decimal point, that's 1, 2, 3 numbers, okay? So you take your decimal point, you go 1, 2, 3, and that's where you put your new decimal point. So when we're looking at this new number, make sure you always put a 0 before your decimal point. It's 0.010256, okay? That's your answer. That's just the easy way of how you can manipulate a decimal point either to the right or left when you're multiplying by the power of tens or when you're multiplying by the power of tenths. Very big difference. Again, could you easily plug it in your calculator to figure out the number? Absolutely. Okay. So, now we are going to talk about converting a decimal to a proper fraction. So, what we are always going to remember, let me erase this too, is that a decimal point is never a whole number, okay? If you have 0.3, we know that that number is 3/10. 3/10 is not a whole number, it's a portion of a whole. So you always look at the place to the right of the decimal and figure out what number it is. We know that this is 3/10. To convert it to a proper fraction, we literally just put 3/10. That's a proper fraction. We will make sure that we always reduce fractions to the lowest terms. For instance, everybody knows 0.5 is 5/10. Well, 5/10, is that reduced to lowest terms? No. You know 5/10 is 1/2. You will always make sure to reduce it to lowest terms. So let's talk about a bigger decimal. Let's talk about, always do your 0.1256789. I'm just making up a number. Well, this looks like a very long number. How are we going to convert this to a fraction? Well, all you got to do is count your places to the right of the decimal. We have tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, on and on and on. So we literally just take this number and put it over 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 over our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that is our fraction. Of course, will we have to reduce this to lowest terms? Absolutely. Remember, if you ever have even numbers, you divide by 2 all the way down. This will take a long time. You won't see a number this big, okay? But that's just an example of how to convert decimals to proper fractions. Let's do another one. We have 0.25, okay? Well, we know 0.25 is not a whole number. It's a portion of a whole, but we do know this is the 10th spot and this is the 100th spot. So to convert it to a proper fraction, you would put 25, and remember this last spot is the hundredths, so you'd put it over 100. Is that reduced to lowest terms? No. We know 25 goes into 100 4 times, so your proper fraction would be 1/4. Do 0.30 for me. Again, we know that this is never supposed to happen because we never have a trailing 0. But if you're confused, could you not see that this is still 3/10? you would put your 3 over your 10, and that would give you your proper fraction. Is 3/10 reduced to anything lower? No. So your answer is 3/10. So when you are converting a decimal to a proper fraction, just remember the last place of the decimal. For instance, 0.25, we know this last place is hundredths. You would put that whole number over your hundred. Okay? Always look at the last place of the decimal and then put that over that number. That's how you convert a decimal to a proper fraction. You will always make sure to reduce to lowest terms. I know in previous math classes, you have all heard of rounding to a certain place. Okay? You have to know how to round all through dosage calculation. So remember that chart at the top of page 34, you have your tenths, hundredths, thousandths place. All right, when we round, let's do an example, 10.25678, okay? I am going to tell you to round this number to the nearest hundredth. Well, you always find the place I tell you to round it to. We know the 2 is the tenth spot, the 5 is the hundredth spot, okay? So you look at the number I'm telling you to round to, and you look at the number to the right. If the number to the right is greater than or equal to 5, you take that initial number and go up 1 point. If that number is less than or equal to 5, well, not equal to, if it's less than 5, you just drop all the numbers and keep your original number. So I am telling you to round 10.256 to the 56789 to the nearest hundred. You look, you see that the 6 is greater than 5, so you're going to take that hundredth spot up 1 value point, okay? So 10.256789 rounded to nearest hundredth equals 10.26. You have to know how to round your numbers. Let's do 3.734. Round it to the nearest tenth. Well, again, we look at our tenth spot, which is right here. You look at the number to the right. Is it greater than or equal to 5, or is it less than 5? Well, 3 is less than 5. So we do nothing to our original tenth spot. We leave it as 3.7 and drop the rest of the numbers, okay? Whenever it tells you to round to a certain spot, that spot should be the last number that you have in your equation. As you can see, 10.26, the last number is in the hundredths place. 3.734 rounded to the nearest tenth, the last number is in the tenth spot. So always look at your number to the right of the rounding rule to determine, do you go up 1 point or do you keep it and drop the rest of the numbers? So there shouldn't be many questions about rounding. That is all review from previous math. So in terms of decimal points, like I said, you need to know a couple things. You need to know how to write a decimal point out into words. You need to know how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. I highly recommend you use your calculator for all those things. There's no need to perform it out longhand when you'll have a calculator for every test. You will see multiplying by the power of 10 or multiplying by the power of 1/10 by moving your decimal point to the right or left. And then you will see rounding. You'll see rounding rules throughout all of dosage calculation in nursing school. So make sure you understand how to round appropriately.